Okay, so now we're going to continue with the second part of the PNS, which is the information about the cranial nerves. So cranial nerves emerge or connecting to the brain. We have 12 pairs. They are bilateral. And then some are sensory, some are motor, some are mixed. So it means that they are motor and sensory. And some of them, they are part of what we consider the special senses. So we have these three that we already saw part of it, I remember, that are part of the special senses. So olfactory nerve is cranial nerve number 1. It starts in the nasal mucosa, in the roof of the nasal cavity. So we have receptors there that binds odor molecules, and then they start these action potentials that are transmitted into the neurons that goes across the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and then you have a connection inferior to in the frontal lobe that is called the olfactory bulb, where these neurons synapse, and then you have a series of neurons that goes from that olfactory bulb back into the olfactory cortex, extending some axons that are called the olfactory tract as a group. So then, function of cranial nerve number 1, it is smelling. And then the olfactory cortex is located in the medial temporal lobe and the limbic system. So that's where we create memories for olfaction. And then optic nerve, or cranial nerve number 2, starts in the retina. It has these axons that exits the retina and then forms the optic nerve, or cranial nerve number 2, that enters into our brain through the optic canal of the sphenoid, if you remember. And then part of the right side crosses to the left, part of the left crosses to the right, will be the medial side of this nerve. The lateral side just runs ipsilateral. And then it makes synapse at the lateral geniculate nucleus in the thalamus. And then from there, we have the optic radiations that goes to the primary visual cortex, which is located in the posterior region of the occipital lobe. And then we have vestibulocochlear, which is cranial nerve number 8, which has 2 different fibers. One's coming from the cochlea, which help us to hear. Another one from the vestibulum, which is part of the vestibulocochlear apparatus inside our middle ear. And these one help us to maintain balance. Okay, so then the vestibular fibers goes to the cerebellum and the medulla. And then the cochlear fibers goes to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. Now for motor cranial nerves and their functions. So we have oculomotor, which is cranial nerve number 3, innervates 4 out of the 6 extrinsic muscles of the eye, including medial rectus, superior rectus, inferior rectus, and inferior oblique. And then as well, innervates this muscle that is called levatopalpebri, so that we can open up our eyes. And that's the motor function part of it. And then we have this other part that help us to control the diameter of the pupil. Do you know where your pupil is? It's in your eye, it's the opening of your eye. So the pupil changes. It can get bigger, which is called mydriasis, or it can become smaller, which is called miosis. If you go to a dark room, you open up your pupil so that you can receive as much light as possible. If you enter into a bright room where there is a lot of light, your pupils constrict so that you can protect your retina. Okay? So then these muscles that are located in the pupil are innervated by oculomotor. And then we have muscles internally in our eyes that control the shape of the lens. You will see more details in the special senses, but the lens, it's a biconvex structure that can flatten or becomes wide to allow us to see nearby objects. So this process is called accommodation. So then this oculomotor help us to see better, sharp. And then trochlea. Trochlea is cranial nerve number 4. This one innervates the lateral rectus muscle, the extrinsic eye muscle that is called lateral rectus, so it helps us to see to the sides. Sorry, no, I was thinking in the abducens, which is cranial nerve number 6. Trochlea, which is cranial nerve number 4, innervates the superior oblique, which is the Shearer's muscle, so help us look down and out. So that's trochlea. And then abducens, I already told you, help us to see to the side because innervates the lateral rectus muscle. And then we have cranial nerve number 11, which is accessory, spinal, and then cranial. So the cranial part help us to control muscles of the throat, pharyngeal muscles, and also some palatal muscles. And then the spinal part controls 2 muscles, sternocleidomastoid and trapezius. So basically it's for turning and for maintaining our head erect and shrugging our shoulders. So that's the spinal part. Now the hypoglossal or cranial nerve number 12 exits on the sides of the foramen magnum in the hypoglossal canal. It helps to innervate both muscles of our tongue, the ones that are found inside our tongue, which are intrinsic muscles, and the ones that connect to the tongue that are external, the extrinsic muscles. Function, help us to produce a speech, for instance. So those are purely motor nerves, and then we have the mixed cranial nerves like trigeminal or cranial nerve number 5. It has 3 branches, ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular. The sensory will innervate the face, oral, and nasal cavities. Remember what I told you, you can feel temperature or pain in different areas of your face, internally as well, and that information is brought by trigeminal. If you like spicy foods, you get all spiced up. Well, that's a sensation of pain in your tongue, that it is conveyed into the brain by cranial nerve number 5, the mandibular branch. And then motor portion of trigeminal innervates these muscles of mastication, like masseter, that help us to chew, for instance. And then we have, again, these 3 branches that are not collectively known, so they are numbered B1 for ophthalmic, B2 for maxillary, B3 for mandibular. And then facial. Facial has a motor portion that innervates the muscles of facial expression. And then the sensory help us to perceive taste or receive sensory stimuli from taste from the 2 anterior thirds of our tongue. And then the parasympathetic portion of this nerve, it helps for innervating the sublingual and submandibular glands so that we can produce saliva, and also innervates our lacrimal gland so that we can produce tears. Glossopharyngeal, cranial nerve number 9. It innervates the posterior third of our tongue providing taste sensation, and also innervates some muscles in the pharynx and also in the palate. And this one innervates the largest salivary gland that we have, which is found here on top of the masseter, which is called the parotid gland. Vagus nerve, or cranial nerve number 10, which is the longest cranial nerve, it's going to have some sensory information for the throat, ear, thoracic, and abdominal organs. Part of this will be, for instance, decreasing the heart rate, bronchoconstricting, so basically our bronchioles inside the lungs become smaller. Also increases the rate of digestion. So this is part of the rest and digest system, the parasympathetic system. And innervates muscles of the pharynx and larynx. It also helps us to feel sensation of taste above the glottis, which is the lid that covers the larynx. Together with cranial nerve number 9, innervates this area. So here is the location of the different cranial nerves, how they emerge. So our cranial nerves all connect to the brain, not only how they emerge. So this is the inferior view of the brain. Starting from anterior to posterior, you will have cranial nerves 1 through 10 in that order, starting with 1 on anterior part and posterior in the last. And then 11 and 12 switch. So 12 emerges before 11, and it's located within this area. So here is the inferior view of the olfactory bulb, which is part of cranial nerve number 1. That again starts here in the olfactory mucosa. And then here we have the optic nerve, and then the optic nerve crosses in this region anterior to the pituitary gland. This is called optic chiasma. It helps us to see. And then oculomotor, which is cranial nerve number 3, innervates most of these extrinsic muscles in the eyes, and then as well the muscles that control the shape of the lens, and the levator palpebrae superioris muscle in our face. So that's cranial nerve number 3. So 1 through 3 emerges anterior to the pons. And then here we have the pons. So we have cranial nerve number 4 that innervates only the superior oblique, the trochlear nerve. And then we have here on the sides of the pons, we have the trigeminal nerve with its 3 branches, which is B1, B2, and B3. And it has motor information and sensory information that it is found in the face. And then for cranial nerve number 6, which is the abducens, which would be, it's not labeled here. Well, it will be this one in here. So that one innervates the lateral rectus muscle. And then we have facial nerve that innervates all of these muscles of mastication, plus sublingual gland, submandibular gland, sublingual gland, and the lacrimal glands. So that's cranial nerve number 7. And then 8, which is vestibulocochlear, that it's also not labeled in here. That one, oh, it's here. So it's on the other side. This one innervates the cochlea and the vestibule so that we can maintain balance, and then that we can listen, so that we can hear. And then number 9, glossopharyngeal is mixed. So this one innervates tongue and pharynx. And then 10, vagus nerve innervates viscerae in the thoracic or organs in the thoracic cavity and in the abdominal cavity. It's part of the parasympathetic system. Accessory, motor portion innervates sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscle. And then the sensory portion, together with cranial nerve number 9, it helps us to receive sensation from the pharynx area. Hypoglossal help us to move these tongue muscles, and then again 11 emerges after 12. So this is the origin of 12 before 11. So before we move into that part, which is about clinical relevance of the cranial nerves, how will you memorize what cranial nerve is motor, what is sensory, which one is mixed? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. By the way, they are written on Roman numerals. That's the convention. I kind of believe that they still teach that in school. So this is olfactory. This is optic. This is oculomotor. This is trochlear. Trigeminal. This is abducens. Facial. Vestibulocochlear. Glossopharyngeal. Even the name of this one tells you something. Tongue and pharynx. Vagus. And then accessory.
They call accessory spine as well.
Yes, accessory spinal. And then this one will be hypoglossal. Yes, I think, yes. So, out of all these 12, 1, 2, and 8 are special because are part of the special senses. And then for learning which one is motor, which one is sensory. So, some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter most. So S stands for the beginning, for sensory. B for both, which will be motor and sensory. And M will be motor. So then olfactory, sensory, optic, sensory, oculomotor, motor, trochlear motor, trigeminal both, abducens, motor, facial both, vestibulocochlear, sensory, glossopharyngeal, both, vagus both, accessory, motor, hypoglossal motor. And that's just a mnemonic. Don't follow it for life. Silly. Why did you marry that person? He has big brains. But that guy had money. My anatomy professor told me.
Follow the money?
It's hard to get both, I guess. Those people are alone, I guess. Okay, so there are several deficits for cranial nerves, and then typically it can happen after someone has a head injury or a stroke, of course, which is part of these injuries. In terms of facial nerve, when someone has paralysis of this nerve, it's going to be called Bell's palsy, and it's going to lead to inability to produce expression with our muscles of facial expression. Cranial nerve number 2 affects vision. Of course, some people might born blind, and that can be several causes, but one of these can be perhaps damage to this optic nerve. Vagus produces hoarseness of the voice, problems with swallowing, and problems in controlling the internal organs. And then understanding these pathways can help you to diagnose and treat neurological conditions. So here we have an example of Bell's palsy. Which side, thinking about that this one is the right and this one is the left, which side is paralyzed? The right or the left? Why?
She's got that droop. She's drooping on the left side.
Yes, and then sometimes some people just think like the side that it is spastic is the normal one. No, it's the other way around, the one where you can smile. And then something that you can, I don't know, it's really with the eyes of faith, I guess you can see it. But basically, her right eye is more shiny because that's where you have these tears. And on typically the paralyzed side, since you don't produce as much tears, the eye tend to dry. Okay, so those were the cranial nerves and the clinical application. Now, for the structure of these spinal nerves, you already saw part of it. We're going to review a little bit more and then see how they perform specific functions. So a spinal nerve, it's a fusion or a collection of axons that are sensory and motor, and then they connect into the anterior posterior roots of the spinal cord. And then something distinct about these spinal nerves is like they have roots as they connect into this spinal cord, but the roots of the posterior part, which is the sensory, it has a collection of body of the neurons that is located in the dorsal root ganglion. That's how can you distinguish between the motor part and the sensory part. And then after these nerves emerge from the spinal cord, they will split into rami. And then the rami that goes anteriorly will be called the anterior ramus. The one that goes posteriorly will be called posterior ramus. And they innervate different parts of the body. So the posterior innervates the deep back muscles in this area of the skin, while the anterior will innervate the anterior muscles in the trunk. And then some of these, they, from different levels of the spinal cord or the spinal nerves at different areas of the spinal cord, they fuse to form plexuses. So here is the structures of the spinal nerve. So this is the anterior root, this is the posterior root, and again here you have this ganglion, which is the body of the neurons that extends these extensions to bring sensory information to the posterior horns of the spinal cord. So this is sensory, this is motor. And then they merge and they form this spinal nerve. And then you extend a posterior ramus that goes and innervates this part of the body, and the anterior ramus continues its pathway to innervate the anterior and lateral muscles in your body. And now something that it is also part of the spinal nerves is one part of the ANS, the sympathetic nervous system. It has this that is called the ramus communicans that exits from the sympathetic ganglion that is on the sides of the body of the vertebrae. So remember, this is the body of the vertebrae, and then extends its extension and it joins this nerve. So you can see it here. And then everything that is sensory then brings afferent information, and everything that is motor brings efferent information, including sympathetic efferent and also somatic efferent. For the spinal nerve plexuses, so a plexus is a collection or a network of intersecting spinal nerves that has the purpose of providing motor or sensory information into a particular region of the body. So each plexus then is going to have nerves with a specific motor and sensory functions. And then these plexuses can be affected, and then it helps you to understand what can be the neurological disorders that can happen after these plexuses are affected. And then from the plexus we form as well redundancy, so that hopefully we don't have a complete loss of function, and that of course during surgeries is needed to know. And then also it's important for knowing structures for rehabilitation purposes. So the first plexus that we're going to look is the cervical plexus. So the cervical plexus, it is formed by the anterior rami of spinal nerve C1 through C4. And then with this plexus, we provide sensory information to the neck and the posterior head. And then we provide motor innervation to the neck muscles and to the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a muscle that separates the thoracic and abdominal cavities, and it helps us to breathe. So phrenic nerve is formed by the nerve C1, C3, C4, C5. keep the diaphragm alive. C3, C4, C5 form the phrenic nerve. And then we also have sensory information to the skin of the neck, shoulder, and upper chest. So that's the cervical plexus. Now for the brachial plexus. So this brachial plexus provides sensory motor information to the shoulder, the arm, forearm, and head. So that's why it's called brachial. And then this one is formed by the anterior rami of C5 to T1. So you can take part of the spinal nerves of the cervical and then the upper thoracic, which is T1. And then out of these brachial plexus, we have major nerves like musculocutaneous that help us to flex our arm and the forearm, the median nerve that help us to basically flex the forearm and the hand muscles, also the wrist. Ulnar, it helps us to innervate these intrinsic muscles in the hand and finger movements. When someone has paralysis of this ulnar nerve, the hand becomes shrunk because these lumbrical muscles become atrophic. So instead of having kind of a white hand, person end up with like a claw. And then radial. It innervates extensor muscles of the forearm and arm. The axillary nerve innervates specific muscles like the deltoid and teres minor that helps in the movement of the shoulders. Lumbar plexus. So the lumbar plexus provides motor and sensory information into the anterior and medial thigh. So basically this part. Also to the hip and the lower leg. So we have this plexus formed by L1 through L4, the anterior rami. Usually we consider this lumbar plexus together with the sacral plexus, so we call it lumbar sacral division. And then we have major nerves of the lumbar plexus like femoral nerve that innervates the thigh flexors and the extensors, and the obturator that innervates the adductors of our thigh. For the sacral, it has motor and sensory information from L4 through S4, and then it goes into a posterior area for thigh, so it's complementary to the lumbar, so that's why we consider them together. And most of the lower leg, the foot, and part of the pelvis. So major nerves will be the sciatic. This sciatic nerve is the longest spinal nerve that we have. Innervates the extensors of the thigh and leg flexors. And we have, out of these plexus as well, the tibial and common fibular nerves that controls muscles in the leg and the foot. And then the pudendal nerve that it provides motor function to the muscles of the pelvic floor in the perineum, the area between the thighs, and then the external genitalia. So here is the view of these plexuses. C1 through C5 form cervical. And then C5 to T1 forms the brachial plexus. Thoracic will be T1 through T12. And then lumbar, L1 through L4. And then sacral plexus, L4 to S4. And here is the cutaneous distribution and motor distribution of these spinal nerve plexuses. So here is the cervical plexus, providing information, sensory and motor, anterior part of her neck, lateral part of her neck, upper part of the thoracic area, shoulder area, both anterior and posterior. Axillary nerve specifically is going to innervate anterior part, lateral part, and posterior part of the mid area of the arm. Radial nerve in the lateral upper part and lower part from the antecubital area. And then posteriorly, all of this region, together with the radial side of the posterior part, including the lateral part of the first finger, all the middle up to this second row of phalanges, like in the hand proper, like the second and third fingers. And then for the musculocutaneous, this region on the forearm between the wrist and the area that is innervated by the radial nerve. Median nerve in the palm will be going most of the palm, including up to the middle part of the ring finger. The rest will be innervated by the ulnar nerve. And then the ulnar nerve complements what the radial nerve innervates posteriorly. And then here we have the innervation by the median nerve as well. Now here for, that was for the brachial plexus. For the lumbar plexus will be lateral femoral cutaneous nerve. The majority of the lateral part and part of the anterior part of the thigh. This will be the obturator nerve in the medial area for thigh. And then this will be the femoral nerve in between the lateral femoral, cutaneous, and then the obturator nerve, and then all of this middle part of our leg. The other part is going to be the common fibular nerve, and this tiny part of the anterior part of our foot will be the tibial nerve together with this part in here. And this will be the posterior part of the posterior femoral cutaneous nerve. And then here are the corresponding muscles that each of them innervates. Any questions? Okay, and then remember that each individual spinal nerve as well it monitors sensory information from different parts of our body. Those were the dermatomes. And many of these autonomic nervous system axons from sympathetic system, parasympathetic system enters at a particular level from a dermatome. And when they bring sensory information, for instance, about pain, that pain sensation can be interpreted as coming from a particular area, but in that case, that area is not affected. So this is what is called referred pain. So basically the sensation of pain in an area where that pain is not originated. And then here we have an example. So if someone has pain in the heart, this area, which is called the precordial area, it is affected, but also this area, the medial side of the left arm, and sometimes including this anterior area in the mid part of the neck and here posteriorly. So if you look in here, that corresponds to this body region. So it's not where we have the heart, of course. So that's referred pain. Okay, now let's talk about the receptors that receive this stimuli and specifically how they are called based on this stimuli. So if the stimuli is mechanical distortion, physical distortion, these receptors that receive this stimuli are going to be called mechanoreceptors. And the mechanoreceptors in the skin has different names and different function. So we have some that are called tactile corpuscles that help us to discriminate touch with moderate spatial resolution. So basically, you can tell whether with these tactile corpuscles whether an object it is rough, it is smooth, and then they are located in the dermal papilla of hairless skin in the fingertips. That's where we have the tactile corpuscles. Now we have the Merkel discs that are basically nerve endings, tactile nerve endings. They provide fine spatial resolution for discriminative touch. They're found in the basal layer of the epidermis. So they are more helpful for fine touch, these Merkel discs. They are a little bit more superficial than these ones. These ones are deep, these ones are superficial. And then we have Ruffinis, or bulbous corpuscles. So these ones detect stretch and movement. They are located deeper in the dermis and also sometimes in the subcutaneous tissue. So because they are deep, then you have to press harder against the skin so that you can detect deep touch with these Ruffinis. And then we have lamellated corpuscles or Pacinian corpuscles that help us to detect vibration and deep pressure. They are found in the dermis and also in joint capsules. So these ones, all of them help in sensory perception and allowing our nervous system to interpret touch, stretch, pressure, vibration. So especially for Pacinians, they help us to take vibrations for instance, if there is an earthquake. So here is the skin and the location of the different corpuscles and other receptors. Like these are the free nerve endings that help us to feel pain sensation, for instance, or changes in temperature. But these ones that you have here in the epidermis, these will be the Merkel corpuscles or tactile nerve endings. So they have fine spatial resolution, so they are used for fine touch. And then here underneath, we have the tactile corpuscles. These ones detect also fine touch, but with moderate spatial resolution. So these ones are more specialized than this. And then we have these bulbous corpuscles or Ruffinis that responds to stretch and movement. Like if a bug is crawling in your skin, you can feel it with these bulbous corpuscles. And then here we have the lamellated corpuscles that are located not only in this area that is deep in the dermis and also in the epidermis, hypodermis, sorry, but also we have in the joint capsules. So these ones help us to detect vibration and deep pressure. And then for sensory neurons, so you receive a stimuli in the nerve endings that has sensory receptors. You generate an action potential that travels through this axon, and then the axon connects into the body of these neurons in the posterior root ganglion, and then this is a bipolar neuron, so you extend another axon, which is called the central process, that connects to the posterior horns. So this is an afferent or arriving signal. sensory. And then these sensory receptors, they have receptive fields, which will be the area that they can monitor. So within the fingertips, we have many sensory neurons with a small receptive field that overlaps and help us to have a lot of sensitivity. And then in the forearm, we have less neurons, as you can see here, and the receptive field is larger. So you have less resolution in terms of what you're feeling in the forearm versus in the fingertips. And to test this resolution, we use the two-point discrimination test, in which we use specialized device that can touch the skin at a particular distance at the same time, and you ask the person, when the person is closing its eyes, if he can feel 2 points or 1. So in this case, for the fingertip two-point discrimination, the threshold is around 3 millimeters, and then in here, it will be 40 millimeters or 4 centimeters. So basically, the receptive fields are farther apart in here, and in here are closer together. So that's why you can tell with the fingertips when you are touched with this device in 3 millimeters or less really easily, but not in here. Okay, so that's sensory information, receptive fields. Now let's look at the spinal reflexes. So spinal reflexes are important for the maintenance of homeostasis. And reflexes are automatic responses, usually are unconscious, sometimes are conscious, but this automatic response is rapid and it is processed, in the case of the spinal reflexes, initially without input from the brain, and it is processed in the spinal cord. So what are the components of these reflexes? So you have to have a sensory receptor that takes the signal, the stimulus. Can be muscle stretch. You have a sensory neuron that transmits the action potentials into the spinal cord. And then in the spinal cord, you have an integration center in which you synapse this sensory neuron with another neuron or multiple neurons, into which you will have a monosynaptic, which is only one single connection, or polysynaptic, you have multiple connections within the spinal cord. And that center is going to be specifically located in the gray matter. And then you will have an output from these motor neurons that sends the signal into the effector. It can be a muscle, or it can be a gland. And the response will be, in this case, after stretch, muscular contraction. So examples of reflexes. A stretch reflex is monosynaptic, so that means that you have only one connection. It helps to maintain tone and muscle tone and posture. And we have receptors within our muscles that are called muscle spindle receptors that detect how much your muscle has stretched, and then it sends this signal into the spinal cord with these sensory neurons that of course enters in the posterior horns, and then you will connect this neuron with an alpha motor neuron, which is going to stimulate this same muscle to contract, and then that will resist the stretching. So mostly this is involuntary, is rapid reflex, and it helps us to maintain adjustment, like if you were going to fall, to maintain balance. So you adjust the muscle length, and then An example of this will be the patellar reflex or knee jerk. That you're not only testing with the knee jerk these different components, but also you are looking at the integrity of the spinal cord at the level of L3. So here are the components of this stretch reflex. So if you magnify one of these muscle fibers from the biceps, so this is the biceps brachii, so this is the lateral part of the arm, and you see the components. So here in this region we have this muscle that is called the muscle spindle, and this muscle spindle, it is wrapped around by these sensor neurons. So we have primary afferent, and then we have secondary afferent neurons. They detect the stretch of this muscle, and that information, they send that into the spinal cord, and the spinal cord sends back a response with an alpha motor neuron that connects into these fibers. So this is what we call intrafusal fibers, because they're located inside this muscle spindle. This is the capsule. And then we have extrafusal fibers. And then you can adjust the contraction of this muscle. So we have it as well in the tendons, this type of information, this type of reflex. So we have these sensor neurons that tells how much your tendons have a stretch as well. So this is for force, and this is for a stretch, length, and position. So how do you initiate it? Well, if someone grabs an empty cup with its hand and start filling it with water, the water or whatever liquid, the water is going to create some weight, and then it's going to be a force that basically starts stretching these biceps brachii, and then you send these action potentials through these primary and secondary afferents into the spinal cord, and then you will send a relay information into these alpha motor neurons. So this is the posterior horns, this is the anterior horns. And then with this alpha motor neuron, you contract your muscle, and then you can hold appropriately this weight. So that's the integration and response. And then we have other types of reflex, like the flexion reflex and the cross-extension reflex. The flexion reflex, it happens on the same side. So if someone, for instance, is stepping in a sharp object with the foot, that information will arrive into the posterior horns, and then you will have a unilateral reflex that is going to connect this sensor neuron to these alpha motor neurons, so that when you have this painful stimulus transmitted into the spinal cord, your alpha motor neurons in this side stimulate your flexors in this side, so that you can withdraw your foot from whatever object someone step on. And then at the same time, you send a contralateral signal to contract your extensor muscles in the other limb. That's why it's called cross extensor, because it crosses to the other side so that you maintain balance. It's only until here when you kind of think about what is going on. I mean, we don't think about this, but we do it every time. It's a protective reflex. So, let's say that this piece of paper is a nail. And I'm walking, and very inadvertently, I step on it. What is my first reaction? Doing this. And then limping. I'm not going to step on that nail and stay like that, like, I'm so happy. Feels painful. No. And I don't keep this extended, and this I flex it. So I extend this and I flex this to maintain balance. So we stimulate the flexors here and the extensors here. So this is contralateral, the other side, and then ipsilateral for here. For the flexor is ipsilateral, extensor is contralateral. And it has to be not flexing both or extending both at the same time, because if I extending both at the same time, I mean, it will be crazy while you keep stepping in something that is hurting you. Or, and that would be kind of innervating both extensors, but then as well, you don't activate both flexors, which are the biceps femoris, because let's say that I'm walking, I step on this nail, and I don't do this. I don't do that, right? Oh, it feels so great.
There's also times where, like, right before you step on it, you can kind of catch yourself before you actually step on it.
Yes, that would be wise.
Reflex, right?
Yeah, that would be wise. But see, again, and that can be an example, but we do it all the time when we're walking, because sometimes when we walk, we don't walk in an even pathway. There might be some rocks or some grooves in the path, and then we have to adjust flexors and extenders so we can maintain balance. So these reflexes are for maintaining balance. Okay, so we have a test for testing the corticospinal pathway, the upper motor neuron function. So this is called the Babinski reflex. So in our normal plantar reflex, our toes flex downward when someone stimulates your sole. So you tend to do this. But when someone has problems in this corticospinal pathway, and then you stimulate this sole, you will extend your toe upward. And then you spread your toes outward as well. So you basically abduct. In infants, since they still haven't myelinated this pathway, it is positive, the Babinski reflex. So in the adults, we shouldn't have spreading like this and putting up your great toe when someone stimulates you. When it can happen, when someone has a stroke, multiple sclerosis, or injury to the spinal cord. So then we can test for these reflexes to see if there is an injury. So here is the normal plantar reflex. You flex your toes and adduct them. And then positive will be spreading the toes. Okay, so for this coming chapter 14, we're going to see the functions and structures of ANS, autonomic nervous system, We're going to see the major subdivisions, sympathetic, parasympathetic. We're going to see the ganglia, the neurotransmitters, and the role of ANS in homeostasis. Test your knowledge questions. Which spinal nerves from the sacral plexus? C1 through C4, C5 through T1, L1 through L4, or L4 to S4.
L4 to S4.
That's the sacral. What is the function of the posterior ramus of the spinal nerve? Innervating anterior trunk and limbs, containing only motor fibers, innervate deep back muscles and skin, or form nerve plexuses? Posterior ramus. A, B, C, or D? C. That's why it's posterior. True or false that dorsal root ganglion contains motor neurons, cell bodies? Dorsal, is it sensory or is motor? So it's true or false? False. Second, true or false? The femoral nerve arises from the lumbar plexus.
False.
From which arises? Lumbar or sacral? While you think, let's move to the third. All spinal nerves contain both sensory and motor fibers.
False. All. Sensory motor. Oh, true. It senses, right?
And then also help us to move. And then your answer, define a spinal nerve plexus and explain its functional significance. What is a plexus? Form a plexus with your fingers, like if they were nerves. It's a network. And they provide innervation to a particular area to give redundancy and to form nerves, of course. Let's move to the next. So we stop recording.